Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to talk today about a student mapping project that started in October of last year, wrapped in May of this year, and I think it turned out pretty well. The students in question that I'm talking about are Frostburg students. In particular, they are members of Gamma Theta Upsilon. Are there any GTU members in the room? Oh, I see one hand. So it's the International Geographical Honor Society, for which I am Frostburg's chapter advisor. GTU is involved in varied service projects. So we have a Youth Mappers chapter, so things like mapathons. We maintain a stretch of Adopt a Highway near campus. We service the departmental needs with things like majors fairs or welcoming students for things like STEM events, etc. So they're a great group of students, albeit a small group of students. And last year, a couple of individuals contacted me via email, sort of just cold call out of the blue. And these individuals live in the DC metro, and they had purchased a property in the neighboring county from where campus is. And essentially, the map that they had of their property, when they would go out and hike around, they tended to get disoriented and they got lost. And so they reached out to me to see if there was an interest in a mapping project that I could provide to the students. And so my cartography class was fairly small, and it seemed like the time frame was going to be maybe a little bit longer than a semester. And so I reached out to the honor students to see if they were game, and they were. So last year over Zoom, they met with the two families bought this property, so they met with all of the landowners on Zoom and discussed logistics on how they could maybe help them with a new map. And so essentially the methodology was to use the old map that essentially get lost, just like the landowners were getting lost. But while they were doing it, they were going to do it with GPS receivers, and so they could essentially, like digital breadcrumbs, just look at the overall tracks and determine where there were trails, and essentially through a process of multiple iterations of going out there and looking at the data, ground truth, where there were actual trails, where people got lost, with the end goal being a new map that's aesthetically pleasing and essentially took into consideration the design elements that the owners were expecting. And so sort of that's where we started to orient you on the location that we're talking about. We're about 2 hours to the southeast of where we are today. So Garrett County is the westernmost county in Maryland, and so the property is about 10 minutes south of the town of Grantsville. It has a Grantsville mailing address. But it's sort of in the middle of nowhere, and campus is denoted with the little bobcat symbol there. It's about 20 miles from campus or so, and the property is an environmental land trust. It's tied into, let's see if that's loose. Yeah, it's tied into Airbnb and things like that. So they're really interested in having something that visitors and family can utilize. It sits on about 60 acres. It's a very pretty piece of land with varying topography. It sits up against a state forest, so the land itself is protected, and it's right up against protected land as well. And some parts are overgrown, but it's very pretty. And essentially, the process was just to go out there with this original map and try to make sense of where we were. And I mean, the first couple of visits, it was a little messy. But so essentially, we just started with data collection. The first round of data collection began in very early December, before the weather turned kind of foul. And you can see some of our students there, some of my students there, with one of the family dog, getting ready to go out and collect some data. And really, data collection should just be called the sausage making of the entire thing, because when you actually went out, those are some Garmin eTrex 10s, GPS receivers, and going out with the actual physical copy of the map and trying to make, I showed students how to drop waypoints for trail junctions, or if there were varied, it's a pretty big piece of property, so if there were down trees or some old cultural landscape features, show them how they could drop it on the map, and ultimately like find trail junctions, etc. And it was pretty messy in the beginning, and the sausage making took more than a single semester. And so some of the students that were engaged in the project ended up graduating and have gone off to graduate studies. And so some of the students are still there, but most of the students have sort of graduated in the last year or so. Because it's an honor society, there's a certain set of criteria, and usually the students are juniors or seniors before they ever enter the club as it is. Those that had a little bit more time and really more invested in how the sausage making was going, I showed students how to extract data off of the GPS receivers. If you're familiar with open source software like DNR Garmin, or I guess it's called DNR GPS now, but showed students how to extract GPS data in varied formats like KML, just to look in Google Earth, or shape files, or just pure GPX data for something like OpenStreetMap, so we could start to visualize the data in any way that we really needed to. And so in the very beginning, the first couple of iterations, just a sloppy transformation just of in Google Earth, trying to fix Elk Ridge Lane with the property map and trying to see, again, it's very ugly data. And then I found a county shapefile of the different parcel boundaries, and so the actual parcel boundaries in a georectified 1 to 24,000 map, starting to actually fix that sloppy map and to give it a proper spatial reference and fix it into geographic space. Just as a side note, all of those lines are jutting off to my house, where I then turned on the receiver just to download the data. That's why they're leaping off the map like that. But you can see kind of quickly that the general idea of that trail map, it's not wrong, but there's a lot going on there. There are some trails that don't actually exist. I think the previous owners mapped some game trails for animals and such. It's not all just pedestrian. But when all of the data was collected, it was about 8 or 9 visits to this property with varied students and colleagues and family members. You can see ultimately the trail, sort of like the GPS channelizing where the trails are or where they are not. And you can see there's some spots where, I totally went off the trail there and had to turn around and come back. It's not very tricky to sort of see where the house was located in the property. And so not all of it are actual trails. Some of it is messy. The neighbor's dog actually in here sort of ran over. And so this is just students returning the dog and walking down the driveway. And so we sat down with the students and the landowners as this started to build out and identified what was definitely a trail and where it was just noise. And so this is sort of near the end of coming up with just trying to make sense of all of that data and clean it up. This was in May of this year. This is probably where I picked up the 4 ticks that I brought home with me in the Jeep that afternoon. But I went out one more time to kind of make the final call and ended up with sort of just a clean baseline. I struggled on how to title this slide, but just a starting point to then pull into Illustrator and start the symbolization process. And it really was a collective effort from start to finish with student suggestions and input and landowner input. This image is from the property. This is Fairy Town that one of the family members had put in the property. The person that actually put it there is in the image there, and she thought it was super important that be on the family's trail map for whenever they're there and camping and visiting. And so I asked what her favorite color was, and she said it was purple, and the only trail that they had named or identified was this Dorothy Trail. And essentially the only reason that identified it is because it's an old logging trail, and it's an old logging road, and it's wide enough that it's an actual trail that you could just sort of walk up. And so I promised her that we would make that trail purple because her favorite color was purple. And so trying to use like the landowner suggestions and what was important to them in the ultimate construction of the map. And so again, clean baseline, but then just sitting down with students in the lab and writing down notes and chatting, what color should we do? And do you like this? Should we make it a little bit bigger? Like increasing the line thicknesses and things like that. And just just really trying to take all these things into consideration. My students pointed me towards this Instagram page. I don't know if anybody follows this color palette. It's really good if you're looking for different color options. And so I think there was a Barbie reference earlier this morning. It's nice to see it come back. But so the students pointed me towards, they gave me general ideas, like we want colors from this scheme, or we want colors, for instance, like that Apocalypse Now orange. They really liked that particular color, and so tried to identify a spot where you're just using the eyedropper tool, pick up the RGB values, and then plug it into the symbolization. How are we on time? We're doing okay. I had an iced coffee before this, so I'm sorry I'm kind of flying through it. But to bring you back, if it comes back on the screen, here's the original map, and then after, again, starting in December through May, really what we came up with was that. And if anybody wants like actual copy you can pick up and hold, there are some in the back on the way out. But it's just an 11 by 17 map so that people can easily fold it in their pocket while they're out and hiking. And so I think it turned out pretty well. The landowners really enjoyed it. The students are pretty proud of the colors and stuff that they chose. I probably should have put a zoomed in image on it, but you can see Fairy Town is the little fairy PNG there, and there's a watering hole where bear and stuff, there's a trail camera. So just different features for the family and the visitors that come there to stay, so they don't get lost the way they used to. It is private trails, but because I had the GPX data and I'm maybe an intermediate mapper in OpenStreetMap, I pulled some of that data into JOSM and ultimately marked all the trails private. And so if people are out there, if they have something like OSM and, there is no cell phone signal in that area. So the idea of it's SOS only on your phone. But if you download OSM and, you can download the Maryland shapefile, or the data that's there, and you can pretty quickly just open it up without needing cell phone coverage and get around where you're trying to go. And so it's, in fact, let me see here if I got a minute. Let me see if I click on this. Just to orient you, good, it pulled right up. So again, like the property, the fire ring, there's where the little Fairy Town is at the base of the tree off of Fairy Town Trail. And so it's a pretty big property. And just to orient you on where it is, so Frostburg, and not super far from here. So again, if you are relatively local, or if you're in DC or Baltimore, Frostburg, or this area is conveniently located about 2 or 2.5 hours from all 3 major metropolitan areas, or conversely, it's 2.5 hours from civilization, depending upon what service needs you have. But I really like the idea that that people that are there can pull that data. Where did it go? They can actually have access to that, whether or not they have a paper map or not. It is a land trust, and so there is this idea that there's educational component and an outreach component. And so really, even though this was sort of the initial endeavor, making a map, sort of poetically, it's charting new opportunities in this 60-acre land trust. It should probably be SUAS, but I mean, the idea maybe to go out there and do some drone mapping, as well as dig some soil pits, because it's essentially a living lab, and the owners are super interested in the idea of bringing different sorts of students out to analyze their property in varied contexts. There's an old orchard that is overgrown, and they're interested in the idea of reinvigorating that and maybe exploring some sustainable agriculture. There's an old weather station, so the idea of maybe putting a new one out. And like I mentioned before, it's an old logging area, and so there's some pretty rich historical geography on the landscape. When you look through some of the waypoints that have been gathered, there's some rock piles, and the idea of maybe going through some historical imagery or some historical maps and having a better idea of the overall history of where that land sits is something that the landowners are interested in, and provides new research opportunities for people at campus, things like that. I think That is my last slide. It is not my last slide, so I did want to express some gratitude. I couldn't have done this. It really was a collective effort. I couldn't have done it without student work. And so it really was an immersive, experiential mapping project that the students facilitated. And so I was the captain of the ship, and they directed me on what they wanted it to look like, and I showed them the process along the way. I had some faculty come out with me, my colleagues Adam Lewis and Clara Thiel. She is like a tree botanist, so the idea of going out and identifying some endangered and some invasive species out on the property is definitely in the works. And Kate McFall and her family are the owners of the property, and so sincere thanks to them for inviting us to the property and having us engage in this research. And my travel up here was made possible through a couple of grants. The Frostburg University Foundation, they provided some of my funding, and NACIS really is the nicest. I received a travel grant this year, for which I am most appreciative. And with that, I'm sure there's a couple of minutes of questions, or if anybody has questions, I'm happy to try. Thank you. Yes.
So I'm curious as to, a couple of things. One is if you consider, applying what you learned to, future groups of students, maybe going out to public lands and doing this and, on public lands that might need an update to the trail maps, or, there's a forest or something, in the area that it might be more publicly beneficial rather than, a single, family property. But, so I'm just curious if you might, do the same thing, but in that direction. And then, with the ethics of the mapping, you mentioned the OpenStreetMap, marking the trails private. But they're on the map, and I think there's some ethical questions there. So I'm wondering if your students discussed any conversations around the ethics of what to put, not to put on the map, and particularly if there's any, cultural resources that you found, or particular, turn up archaeological thing like an arrowhead or something, in my neck of the woods, there is an issue with archaeological sites that are indigenous, places that might be sensitive places. So have you thought about any of those ethical angles?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the first question was, had there been any applications outside of a private landowner context? And there's certainly applications, but in terms of pursuing them, not yet. Refer to the intro. I'm quite tired. I have not. This was truly serendipitous. This wasn't something that I had tried to put together. And in terms of the ethical implications, it's a really good question. There were no protocols in place, not that I'm aware of. So I'm ignorant to some of the indigenous people that maybe would have been encountered there. But so there was nothing in place as far as if we found something that was maybe sensitive, what should happen. But given that they are honor students and there's a really good rapport and communication, I don't think they were the kind of students who maybe just flip things over or pick things up. But no, that's a super helpful thing to incorporate in future work. So no, but yes, down the road. Yeah, thank you.
We do have time for more questions.
Works for me. Thank you.